Okay, this lesson concerns the question that is deliberately asked, and uh, the question is formulated to provoke the only question we could actually ask about anything in the Bible. Is there more than one kind of election? That is election scripted or is it constructed? If it's a construct, as we hear often spoken today, similar to a name it, claim it type of election where someone just declares themselves, let's say people can call themselves a Calvinist and then they can refer to the construct called Calvinism. And within it, they can refer to elements and glossary of terms and constructed argumentation, syllogistic reasoning, even point to texts that they use to support their Calvinism. But if you were a Calvinist, you would know that is a Calvinist to study the Bible. You'd know that no text supports Calvinism. Calvinism is a fallible soteriological construct, and a lot of the banter over election doesn't seem to be the purpose for which Jesus reasoned outwardly people for himself, and it certainly doesn't appear to be anything that is bounded, if you will, by the either orism, conditional or unconditional, individual or corporate. Those don't seem to be conveying or communicating, positing outwardly from a text any implication in the context. So let's look at Luke 6:13. I'll be as expeditious as possible. And this says, and when day came to be, he, that's Jesus, sounded toward the students, his particular students. Notice mathetes here, as in mathos, as opposed to pathos. Pathos is passion. It's the first word in pathological, as in pathological, let's say, where you might hear the phrase pathological liar, where the person has seemingly no rationale, no cognitive rationale. Their behavior is emotive, irrational. Their reasoning is fragmented and incomplete. Well, this is not that. This is reasoned, sound, ordered, sequential, similar to math itself, math, where 1, 2, 3, 4, you don't really jump to another number until you understand the first number, even in discrete math. But so here he sounded toward his particular students. Remember, articular, that's a definite article. And here's that word from eklegomai. That's where we get ex out from. It's middle, for himself, reasoned outwardly for himself, away from them. So he reasoned outwardly for himself, 12, away from them, back to the students, whom also he named apostles. So notice the set out from which he reasoned outwardly for himself. That for himself is to serve his interest. And you notice election today, the banter is, do you believe election happened before the foundation of the world? And they mean somewhere out there before the world ever existed. And yet they won't notice, as those of you who study and use your King James Bible, when I say use the KJV, I mean emphasis on the three letters USE and KJV, not do you have the KJV in your room or your office or your study when you're not finding an interest in its use, USE. So we're speaking of hermeneutics, apologetics, we're talking about context, we're talking about looking at the words. So if you look up those words, for example, in Ephesians 1:4, and you notice, I think that says the foundation of the world. And when you go to Hebrews, book of Hebrews, you'll notice laying a foundation. Well, the word laying there in the English is the word for foundation here. And the word foundation in English, the book of our covenant, the book of Hebrews, is a different word than this one. Now, if you use USE, you would notice that. So it would help you understand that that refers to Paul speaking of, and it's us, he said chose us, that's first person, the antecedent of that pronoun. Paul speaking of those apostles that was chosen. Paul was the 12th apostle. And let's just look at that for just a moment. Let's think about this First of all, in the banter, the unnecessary banter, you're given these options. And you notice, first thing we do when we're given these options is we will consider those are only options. So we will start a conversation. Is election individual or corporate? Well, you notice what's missing, and it's the very thing that I just mentioned. Let me clean that up. Sorry about that. So we're asked, is it individual or corporate? And that's an either or. So either individual or corporate. Well, that's a false dichotomy because it's neither. It's even Ephesians, that's a church letter. So the answer here is neither. So we'll come over here and correctly state it. That is, contextualize it. It's ecclesiastic. Well, let's just say ecclesiastical. There we go. So election is ecclesiastical. So from his students, those who had been called and called out, meaning they accepted the call. The word call means invitation. They had accepted, came out. These are his guests, if you will, students. And he said these are his brothers and mothers and sisters. You remember when his brothers biologically and his mother Mary were seeking his attention and trying to gain his attention while he was teaching in the temple. He was told, and the message was, hey, your mother and brothers are wanting to speak to you. And he said, behold, notice my mother and my brothers. And he was pointing to those who are doing his Father's will, which was sitting at his feet learning. So his mother Mary and his biological brothers, if you will, other children of Mary, should have been sitting at his feet. And he was using that as a teaching moment. Always a teacher, always taking advantage of those occasions that would arise. And he seized that moment and said that. So here, this assembly, these people who congregate, like the metaphor sheep. Now the sheep are flock. They flock to the shepherd and they respond. So when he sounded toward them, toward his students, his particular students, and from those he reasoned outwardly for himself. That was his interest that he was serving. I remind you, let me find my text here. But we have a note where Jesus said, answered them, have I not chosen you 12? Now we know to whom he's speaking. He's speaking to the 12 apostles. But one of the 12, he says, and one of you is a devil. So it's interesting how that's omitted in the conversation, because one was chosen who was a devil, and yet from what set was that? Well, we know that when the religious leaders shouted crucify, people went along with it. And even at the cross, Jesus asked his Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. And it was on the day of Pentecost that those who were pricked in the heart, pierced in the heart, learned what they had done. They had taken the one whom they had heard and learned, the Hamashiach, the Messiah, and they, with wicked hands, went along with these people and supported and even were incited by the fervor to demand his crucifixion. So there were plenty of people that he could have chosen to be Judas, and Judas had to be paid. They yelled crucify for free. So it's just interesting that that's not noticed and often included in the conversation. And certainly it's seldom, even less noticed, that the church letters, the apostles' doctrines, the entirety of the New Testament, Paul, the 12th apostle, of those baptized Jewish men, you remember John the Baptizer came, he baptized people, having prepared them, or that as ones who, having been prepared, remain prepared and readied, if you will, for Jesus. So Jesus came, called them. John pointed to Jesus, said, notice, behold means notice, the Lamb of God which takes away the sin of the world. So they walked away from John and began to follow with Jesus. So those students, these students with Jesus, then they with Jesus began to baptize. And John later would learn that the students of Jesus, that church assembly, called out those who answered the invitation, severed their ties, first from John, And obviously, by being baptized by John, they had severed their ties from the Pharisees. And later we found quite a disappointment when we saw the students of John and the students of the Pharisees. A portion of them had begun to make an alliance, and later that was all corrected when we noticed, I believe it's in Acts 19, where that was dealt with swiftly. But there is no rationale or interest being served by this question because it doesn't exist. It's only ecclesiastical because outside of a New Testament church, there is no purpose. Jesus is connected to the New Testament church. For example, in Corinth, he's the head. According to Colossians, he's the head of the body. That head body metaphor is so self-evident, but it's in actuality the truth that his headship is the application of the sovereignty of the Godhead. The Son of God, the one in whom the fullness of the Godhead dwells bodily, resides as the head of the body. Now, to miss that connection is somewhat deliberate. And then to somehow outside the context of a New Testament assembly, congregation, those reasoned outwardly for him to serve his interests, that is, as he said to the church in Rome, those of us who love him are called according to his purpose. You remember when the craze went throughout the country about 40 days of purpose and purpose-driven life, everyone was seemingly looking for their own personal purpose. And yet, it was not very self-evident to many that we might, in search of our own purpose in life, we might be forsaking his prerogative or ignoring it because he reasoned outwardly for himself for his own interest away from them 12. And he even said to the 12, I chose you all, and among those of you I chose, one's a devil. And even the night in which he's betrayed, they're asking, is it I who would betray you? Because of course they would know it wasn't them. So if there's such a thing as election, and there is no such thing as that being apart from the context of ecclesiastic. It's ecclesiastical. So I really don't know how, if the entirety of the New Testament is the apostles' doctrine, Acts 2:42 says they steadfastly continued in the apostles' doctrine, and in the fellowship, that's communion, common union, which presupposes the next statement, the breaking of bread, that's the Lord's Supper. And then that is followed with the prayers. Those are definitive prayers specifically mentioned in the New Testament, pastoral letters specifically, and even in the life of Christ, he taught us to pray to the Father who art in heaven, our Father who art in heaven, and our desire for his name to be hallowed, set apart, sanctified, to request his will to be done on earth just like it is in heaven, and to ask of that, and that be our aim and aspiration in our specific prayers, and even to acknowledge a daily dependence upon him for daily needs. It seems to be quite omitted in the conversation today when people want to know, did he pick me to go to heaven or did he not pick me to go to heaven? That doesn't seem to be the end for which this purpose is expressed and stated. So if someone says, well, in the New Testament letter, let's say in the church at Ephesus, for example, if you ignore the purpose for which the us were chosen for himself, that's the same language. Paul used the same language there. Then he was there, that katabole, which a knocking down, a casting down, which was as much to take down one kind of order and, on the other hand, establish the new covenant kind of order, which would find a body there under the headship connected to the head, Jesus. And the Bible even says we believe into Jesus, the person. We enter him by faith, and we're baptized into Christ. And Paul said in Ephesians 5:32, he's speaking of Christ, that is the assembly. So when we're baptized into Christ, that is the assembly to live out this life that we received when we entered Christ by faith. So it seems quite strange because people will argue about election, and even recently someone tried to initiate a conversation about irresistible grace, And my only question was, well, how do you resist scripted baptism? How do you resist being fellowshipped into the gospel in a new covenant body? How do you resist being under the headship of Christ as he's connected directly to his body, an ecclesia in any strategically localized in any particular area? So it seemed like a lot of adaptation, a lot of modifications similar to what Paul dealt with when people began to modify the message, the gospel. He said it's a different kind. They want to turn the gospel into something else. So they took one thing, the correct message about justification out from the faithfulness of Christ, and turned it into something else, which is not another gospel. It seemed like the idea here, the purpose of election, seems to have been lost in all of this, because I'm not sure. I can't find people who insist that God picked them, and somehow they think that forensic means picking that God picked them was the purpose for which he outwardly reasoned for himself. I don't know how they avoid assembly, since the new covenant says we aren't of those who turn back. We're not of those who forsake the assembling of ourselves. So I'm not really sure. But when you bring the context into it, the apostles' doctrine, the New Testament letters, the church letters, to those very specific, and you remember Jesus taught he's the good shepherd. He had sheep. He had more than one sheepfold, but he would never have to outsource, regardless of how many flocks, if you will, of sheep he would have. The word church is mentioned in plural churches. He would never have to place one of his flocks under the care of a hireling. So each church, strategically localized throughout the world for the last 2,000 years, the prevalence of his definitive kind of church, doesn't know of anything about a selection by the one who's connected to the body in that strategically localized in any particular area being accomplished outside of that or apart from that. So people might have our own interests served, but it doesn't appear to be accomplished. So until this conversation is scripted, we're talking about a different kind of election, which is not the election that this middle voice, this reasoning, the reasoning of the one in whom the fullness of the Godhead dwelt bodily, reasoned for himself and his own interest. He would know the reason and purpose for choosing, and he would know why that's to serve in his particular church where he has his sovereignty connected in a demonstrable way called his headship. So when you read the church letters, if you're not attached to and been elected into one of those particular type of bodies, then whatever purpose you are accomplishing, it's not this here. This is very much attached and incapable of being detached any more than you could detach the shepherd from his sheep. Even if one of his sheep strays, he would leave the 99 to go and retrieve it. He certainly won't be at the head of the body, able and willing to be detached from the body where he serves as the head. So at Landmark Missionary Baptist Church, for example, in Jacksonville, Arkansas, where we faithfully gather for the full purpose to provoke each other into love and unto good works, and that form of worship to come together collectively, congregate, flock to our shepherd, assemble as guests those who were not only called, that is invited, but severed our ties and came out so that we might achieve that focus and that, if you will, centricity where we converge on Christ. I'm not really sure how much more plain and clear it could be. It just seems to be something that isn't as attractive as someone supposing their banter, which seems to really find people more interested in the friction. But you can pick either one of these. It doesn't mean you're in one of the Lord's churches. You can pick that you were picked, but it doesn't mean you're accomplishing anything that serves his interest, because outside of one of his New Testament churches, the New Testament itself, ironically, has no knowledge of how you're carrying that out and what you're doing. Now, there's plenty of things out there. I'm certain they're wonderful, but let's not confuse it with election, of which the context speaks specifically and very clearly. So have a blessed day, and I'm certain this has helped, but you can study that, put it in the context. But you can't study the doctrine of election and say that somehow you're involved in establishing a new covenant kind of order, harmonious arrangement. That word order in Ephesians there, where it says before the foundation of the world, that's the word order, cosmos. And it's before the downcast knock something down, or to the incipient establishment of something. It's both in that text. One thing comes down, because brick and mortar temple would be down soon after the letter to Ephesus. It would be down within a few years. That brick and mortar was coming down, just as Jesus said. The old covenant had already been done away at the cross. The new covenant was underway, and Paul, the missionary, the one sent, was going out preaching the gospel. Those who believed it were being baptized and severing their ties, and through baptism declaring God right and coming together as a covenant community all over. And within the first 3 centuries, incalculable numbers of people had heard the gospel and had come out and severed their ties through baptism, declaring God right, and become a covenant community, a body of Christ under his headship, very well connected, very well fitly framed, if you will, and doing much to grow up to the full measure, the stature of the head of that particular body, Jesus the Christ, and to be conformed to his image as that new man that body was and is today in every new covenant community and body. So have a blessed day and rejoice that you can know God's purpose for your life. So if you're a deacon serving in a New Testament church and that's marginalized, or someone really doesn't admire that, it's because they don't understand the doctrine of election. If you're a brother in the covenant and you're head of a household, a father to children, a husband to a wife, a brother in that covenant, and you're a servant in that body, modeling the behavior of Christ in word and deed, people may be marginalizing that. They'll ask you silly questions. Do you think it's individual or corporate? And the whole time you're carrying out the purpose for which God not only called, but then you answered the call, invited, severed your ties. You had been fathered through the gospel. You were invited to come out. You did. You're a guest. You received baptism, scriptural, scripted baptism. You were fellowshipped into the gospel there, that common union. You self-examine, self-correct. You present your family at the Lord's table. You really, like a lot of us who've been serving for years, according to the purpose for which we were outwardly reasoned for his interest, we really can't find anything about this banter in the religious world to which we're alive. We're not alive to that. It doesn't really quicken us, incite us. It's kind of a dead, unscripted, empty, vain jangling. So have a blessed day, and prayerfully, if you've been fathered through the gospel, just read your Bible and you'll know exactly what he expects in the interest of Christ as they're served in his new covenant churches, communities that have prevailed for 2,000 years. Have a blessed day.